guest today needs little introduction, and you may even chuckle at this slightly shameless plug for a project I've gotten to work on over the past year. But the conversation you are about to hear is with my colleague and mentor, Jason Koop. Jason is entering his third decade of coaching and poured that knowledge into what is now the second edition of Training Essentials for Ultrarunning. I got to join him as a co author along with Jim Rutberg in bringing this large book to life, and it's live, it's on Amazon right now. The following conversation explores lessons learned in that writing process and how those lessons can be applied to our own coaching and training, and what you can expect from the new book, even if you already own the first edition. Okay, mics are hot. Everything goes. Nothing is going on the editing room floor.
That's scary.
It is a little scary. We'll see how this goes, but I am joined today, as you all know, by my colleague, I call him my boss. He will fight me to the death on that term. Jason Koop, to talk about the book that many of you might have in hand already, despite me sitting here empty-handed still, which is my own fault, about the second edition of Training Essentials for Ultrarunning. And we're very, very excited. I'm very, very excited to have gotten to finally touch a copy at my in-laws' house over Christmas. I did the flip through where I just held it and I was like, look at all these pages. So thank you for joining us
Of
again
course,
today
and
to
I'm
talk about the
sorry you
book.
don't have a copy yet. The release of this has not gone the very prototypical way of most book releases.
Yeah, people got it really, really quickly. I feel like as soon as it went live on Amazon, I was getting pictures sent to me by people who had it in hand, and that seemed insane that it went
Well,
so quickly.
it's a tale of two polar opposites. Some of the process went really quickly, and then other parts of it very, very, very slowly. That's all behind the scenes inside baseball that nobody really cares about. But needless to say, the philosophy that I kind of undertook when releasing it is I wanted to get it in the hands of the athletes first, and so the media and the influencers and the print magazines and the online magazines and things like that, they're just getting them kind of like right now, so the public's had it for a month or so before any of the prototypical promotion happens from reviews and things like that.
Yeah, I'm hoping lots of people woke up to it under the Christmas tree just a couple weeks ago. But maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe it is being a doorstop or a paperweight or something of that nature. But I'm thinking it was a Christmas. It's kind of too big to be a stocking stuffer, right? It's a little
Yeah,
too big to
it's
be a stocking
hefty. It's
stuffer.
hefty.
But I'm hoping it's out in the hands of people. And I guess the big question for people listening at home is: this is the second edition of this book, so why write the book? Why write a second book?
Well, it from the onset, it's always meant to be revised. I remember when Jim Rutberg, who's a co-author on this book alongside you, who kind of got me into this mess in the first place. One of the things that I was very insistent on when we started this project is it doesn't end with the first book. I wanted to create a title and I wanted to create a piece of work that intentionally was set up to be iterative over the course of years. And what that iteration looks like, who knows whether it's 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, or it becomes something online that just gradually morphs. We really didn't know what was going to happen. And so the second book it's really just a manifestation of that initial philosophy, where we wanted it to be more of a living document and not something that ended up as a doorstop eventually. I want people to who have bought the first copy to buy the second copy, and not only people who have the second copy to consume it in both the hardback format and in the audio format and things like that. It's meant to be a resource above and beyond all else, and so it needs to get revised every once in a while with that ethos.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of, having been on the inside, having been part of the writing team for this, there's a lot of stuff in it. There's a lot of new stuff in it. I'm guessing kind of like, if people own the first book, I own the first book. It is earmarked, dog marked, whatever you want to call it. It's highlighted. There's notes in the sides of the pages. I reference it constantly still, so why if people own that book, why should they what's new? Why should people buy the
Well,
second
I
version?
would divide it into two buckets. The first one is the revision of the content that was there, and the basic way to describe that is the content is more technical. I went through a pretty painstaking process in the first writing of the book to really determine how technical I wanted it to be. Realizing that nothing kind of existed in the space at the time, I knew that I couldn't really overshoot the audience because it would essentially kind of get lost on them. And I had the technical skill and and the technical capability, without sounding too arrogant, to overshoot that audience. And so one of the ways that actually plays out in the first edition of the book is a lot of the training strategies and the philosophy and the training design and things like that are kind of brought to the forefront through four characters who are athletes that I worked with: Dakota Jones and Dylan Bowman, two elite athletes, and then Missy Gosney and Eric Glover, two kind of normal athletes. And I utilized their kind of real experiences to turn some of the esoteric natures of what we do as coaches into kind of like real life examples. And I felt that I needed that in a way to make the content a little bit more relatable. And some people would say dumb it down, and I don't think that that's an unfair I don't think that's an unfair description of some of the content within the first book. But the first way that the second book is different is just within that context itself. It's just making the content that was there more technical. And I think that the audience that is out there in ultra running is definitely ready for that at this time. It's 6 years since we published the first book. There are more athletes and more coaches and more scientific papers and on and on and on and on. And the level of the content in the book, I think, is reflective of the level of knowledge within the space as a whole. And then the second basket of content that's new is stuff that I really, for the most part, kind of left on the cutting room floor for the first book because of size constraints and technical constraints and a whole conglomerate of other things. And that runs anywhere from the women's section that you wrote, that you did a fantastic job with writing the specific considerations for female athletes, to considerations for high altitude and hot weather environments, which you played a really heavy hand in as well, to the strength training component, the mental skills component, and all these things that I just thought were either too advanced for the first book at the time, or I didn't feel that the knowledge base existed around them in as robust of a fashion that needed to be to bring it to the forefront in the book. All of those things are new, and so the book's bigger, it's heavier, it's a bigger bigger format, it's 500 some odd pages and things like that. But I think broadly defined, the way to think about kind of the newness of the new content part of the book is the content itself has been revised to be a little bit more technical in nature. And there's these brand new sections where you can just compare and contrast the table of contents to where they just didn't exist before, and it makes the work a little bit more complete. If I'm being honest, the first book had some gaps in it, and some of those gaps were definitely some of them were definitely intentionally there, meaning, hey, I wanted to do this and I just didn't for whatever reason. And some of them were just gaps on my part where I didn't think that the material was relevant or robust enough or whatever, and so I tried to fill those as much as possible. So yeah, it's going to be largely unrecognizable to readers who have the first edition when they pick up the second edition. It's a lot of new material.
Yeah, which is exciting because we're constantly learning more and more, and I think that's reflected in us rewriting. Make like it's in a lot of ways really a new book. And I'm wondering, I know that you had some pushback with the first one coming out, particularly about like the lack of the strength section, right? And it sounds like, and what you just said is that maybe that was one where it's like we just didn't know enough, or you didn't think it was as important, or maybe it got cut because of size constraints. But I think it's really cool that you took some of that feedback and information, and now knowing what we know or what we're trying to learn more about, have made revisions, or in the case of strength training or the women's section or even environmental physiology, we've added entire new sections to the book, like pretty sizable chunks of
Yeah,
writing and
here's the way
information there.
I would compare and contrast that. The environmental consideration section I could have put in the first book, but I did not feel that I felt that that would overshoot the audience, to use a phrase that I brought up earlier. I felt that that type of content was just a little bit too technical, a little bit too advanced to bring to the forefront. Here are all these heat acclimation strategies. Here are altitude acclimation strategies. Here's how you can walk through which one might work or might not work for you. I just felt that it was going to be too technical, kind of right out of the bat, and so I kind of didn't even touch that. The women's specific section, I didn't even think about the first book. Like that was not even a consideration from the get go. And maybe that's poor design on my part, which I can raise my hand for. But that's just the evolution of knowledge and coaching, right? I mean, that's why this book is going to have a third edition and a fourth edition and a fifth edition, and however many iterations it could actually have before it dies a slow death. But we're always gonna learn something. There's always going to be additional kind of nuance to pull out of training for ultra marathons, because still we are really early in figuring this out. If you compare what we know about ultramarathon to the what I'll call the traditional endurance sports, so cycling, running, triathlon, and things like that, we're still a couple decades behind. And that catch up process does not happen very quickly. We might gain, 1 year for every 5 years or something like that. And so we're always going to continue to find out more and more and more. And then the book's going to obviously evolve kind of beyond that every several years.
Yeah, I was recently asked in an interview if I could ask the research community to do like one study, what would it be? And I was like, "Oh man, like basic physiology." Like a basic physiology study like on training methodology
Yeah.
for ultra running because
Yeah.
and we're extrapolating and that's not bad. I think that we can learn a lot from other endurance sports, but I was like, yeah, basic physiology research on ultra runners, that'd be a great place to start. And so keeping that in mind and keeping in mind that I think this book really um embodies this idea that as coaches, we never know everything. Like we're always learning. I think if you're a coach and you think you know it all right now, that's a very dangerous place to be. And I think knowing that this book it's got a second edition, it will probably have a third edition and a fourth edition is because we don't know everything. And that's a good lesson, I think, for all of us to take home. And I'm wondering what other lessons you learned through the process of writing the first one and now writing the second one and
Well,
bringing that to
I
market.
don't know if this is so much a lesson, but this is something that was definitely reinforced when going through both editions of the book. And this is something that all the ultramarathon listeners out there can take to heart, is that ultramarathons are not long marathons. And we can't really treat them as such from a training and programmatic standpoint. If we do that, it's a failure of coaching, and it's a failure of the athlete. I will say that when I wrote the first book, that statement was a little bit of a leap of faith, because we didn't know as much about the demands of the sport as we do now. And what I mean by that is somebody goes through an ultramarathon, is okay, what were the performance limiters? Was it their VO2 max? Was it the way their muscles worked? Was it the way their nervous system was working? Was it nutrition, hydration, and things like that? We were just barely starting. This is 2005 when I was writing, or 2015, sorry, when I was writing the first edition. We're just barely starting to kind of like crack the door open on some of those answers. And I made this what I would consider a little bit of an extension of the research, to make the statement that ultramarathons are not long marathons, even though the name would connotate quite differently, especially from a training and preparation standpoint. I can say now that we've had 6 more years of research and we had 6 more years of coaching practice and things like that, that statement is even cemented further in my philosophy and in my what I do and what we all do as coaches, where yes, there are certain fundamental physiological principles that are going to apply across any of the endurance sports. But if you're just saying, hey, listen, I'm going to get somebody in half marathon shape and expect them to perform well on an ultra marathon, that's just not going to cut it, because of all of these other different considerations that exist in ultra running that don't even get mentioned in half marathon running or in marathon running: nutrition considerations, environmental considerations, how much muscle breakdown occurs during the course of an event, how your nervous system is affected after running for hours and hours and hours on end. All of those things don't pop up in the marathon literature, right? It's all how big is your VO2 max? How much of the fraction of that VO2 max can you utilize? And what is your cost of running? I mean, that's Nike breaking two on repeat, right? You're trying to optimize those three variables for performance. And one of the things that one of the collaborators on the audiobook really brought to the forefront through his research is this multi-factorial approach to ultramarathon performance, where it has maybe a dozen different key factors, of which we're still kind of teasing out all of their various importance, and we will for quite a while. But certainly, we can say it's more complicated and intricate and nuanced than what we would typically think about for marathon performance.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the audiobook more in a second because I think it's really, really cool. And I'm very, very excited about that format being released alongside the books. But you've got a good take home message there. And I'm wondering if there's anything else from the writing process that you've brought into your coaching, because clearly that is something that I think is applicable not only to runners, but it's applicable to coaches coaching ultra runners. Is there anything else that you gathered during the writing process that you're like, I need to bring this into my coaching, or you see it in the interactions you're
Yeah,
having
I
with your
would honestly
athletes?
say it's a little bit of a theme that this might be my 2022 theme. We're recording this like the first week of the year, so maybe we'll see. We can record at the end of the year and see if this kind of plays out. But it's really to zoom out, because a lot of times in the difference between the first book and the second book, or one of the differences between the first book and the second book, really illustrates this, where I was trying to bring things out through very specific examples, but that's very limiting because those specific examples are limited to those individuals. That's how I coached those specific people, specifically Dakota Jones, specifically Dylan Bowman, specifically Missy Gosney, and specifically Eric Glover. And when I was writing the second book and I kind of ripped all those individual examples out, I had to learn how to communicate those ideas for everybody, right? To zoom the lens out and say, okay, here's broadly how this application would is actually functionally valuable for an athlete. And what you mentioned, some of the criticism around the strength training. Honestly, the biggest one, the biggest one was there's no training program in it, right? You're not going to open it up and turn to page 270 and here's your 12 weeks to your first 50-mile program. That theme is even more enhanced in the second book, where people are going to have to dog ear and highlight and underline and create notes and things like that. They really are going to have to apply a certain amount of thinking for themselves with this. There are no kind of magic answers, and I've brought that into my coaching, is to really kind of try to zoom the lens out a little bit, look at each person as an individual, and take these fundamental things that we've known for sometimes long periods of times, and sometimes have just kind of recently cropped up, and try to figure out how to individualize those for each and every athlete.
Yeah, it is. It's a whole different communication style when all of a sudden you're like, oh, this isn't specific to this person. It's
Yeah.
almost, it has to be generic and yet specific. At like, I've been reading a lot of shoe and ski reviews recently, and it's frustrating and infuriating because I'm like, I need them to do that. I need them to think more broadly than how they liked the ski or liked the shoe. And I think that's kind of a similar example of like, how do you communicate that information to a lot of runners, not just this is what happens when Dakota Jones does this workout or does this training plan type of
Yeah,
analogy
it infuriates me when
there.
I see that as a coach, and that's one of the reasons why even on social recently, we're deviating already, Corinne, which we expected to do. Even on social, like I've started to steer away from, oh, here's what I did for training today. Because I don't want people to take that and say, oh, well, friggin' so and so did this, or Coop did this with this athlete, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. That might be the case, but you're getting lucky if that's the case. This individualization component, like I said, if I were to kind of broaden the book out to just more kind of coaching themes, that piece of it is just becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And also we're more able to do it, I would say, versus 5 or 10 years ago, where we just didn't have a lot of the insight and also the technological capabilities of looking at how those individual characteristics of each athlete unfold into programming and training, and what they should be doing day to day.
Yeah, there's definitely still lots of ends of one out there, lots of echo chambers of this. Well, this works for my athletes. And it's like, okay, well, Does it? Does it work for all of them? Is
Yeah.
this a broad strokes? Like, what's not working for one of those athletes? Because that's physiology, right? It's not black and white. It's shades of gray. It's not that um the stimulus did or didn't work, or the intervention did or didn't work. It's, well, it worked for 7 of the 16 people and it didn't work. And why might it not have worked? Like, I think it's coaching, you have to have that nuance. Like, you can take the science, you can take the information that you've gathered from years and years of experience, and then you have to look at that, you know, you can't just repeat what Jim Walmsley's doing or what Dakota Jones is doing or what Brittany Peterson is doing. You have to be able to say, okay, this is what, this is what we know. This is what I know about this athlete, and this is how I'm going to put these things together
I know
and mesh
athletes
them
hate
up
that though because
perfectly
they just want the
or
answer, right? I mean,
close.
people are like, "Hey, just tell me what to eat. Just tell me how far to run today." Like they just want the answer, and so you can come up with some basic stuff, but to really do it well, I think it takes a lot of individualization for for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking of that, people want to know, aren't you giving away all of your training secrets
No.
by
So
writing this
first off,
book?
they're not mine. Like my name's on the, front of the book. It's got the biggest type font on it alongside you and our other co-author Ruddy, Jim Rutberg. But I will be the first one to admit that I'm not going to lay claim that this is my secret sauce that I came up with or whatever. Like it very, very much so. The entirety of the work is a representation of over, this is my third decade coaching, so well over 20 years of all of the development and mentorship that I have had through people who I owe life debts to for forever. It's I can't express it in words how much of not so much a group effort, but how all of those people and all of those experiences have kind of boiled down into a 500 page book. So that's the first thing, is it's not my secrets or anything like that. The second thing is I've always had this mantra of I want to leave things better than when I found them. And if somebody picks up the book, whether they're an athlete or a coach, and I'll tell you what, the coaching response to this has been kind of mind blowing to me. In fact, I can plug this now because I just got word. So you and I, we helped create this ultra running certification through USCA, and I just found out today that their ultra running sales are outperforming their run sales, which is, yeah, I
So
mean,
cool.
nothing to see here. You think the running market is probably 10x, maybe 20x of the trail running market. To say that running coach, the ultra running coach certification, is outperforming the normal run certification is actually kind of mind blowing. I forgot where I was going with that, but anyway, the the this if I can create a work that improves the training of athletes and improves the coaching of coaches that are working with athletes, I think I've kind of done my job. I've left things better than I found them. And even when I look at it through a strict business lens, like I just look at it through, hey, listen, I'm a coach, I manage a bunch of coaches. Coaching is my business. I get paycheck every month because of coaching and all that other stuff. I've always had this principle that good coaching is good for coaching. Meaning, if athletes are training correctly and coaches are doing the right thing, that's good for the whole ecosystem, and that's good for me. That's good for all the other coaches out there. The rising tide, raises all ships, and all those other, cliches that you want to throw at it. And so, I'm happy to divulge whatever I have learned over the course of my coaching careers to help others, regardless of whether they work with us or not. Because if an athlete has a good experience, irrespective of the coach that they're working with, they're more likely to recommend coaching to a friend, whether or not it's that coach or another coach or whatever. But the opposite is also true. Bad coaching is bad for the ecosystem of coaching, and this is kind of one of the things that I hammer home on a lot when I'm kind of out in the space, is that when I see bad coaching practices, I look at that even when it's from somebody outside of our coaching group. I look at that as detrimental to the whole coaching ecosystem because once again, those athletes have the experience of, hey, my coach didn't respond to my email, or I got hurt, or they made this kind of mistake, or kind of whatever. Then there's not there. Then there's a lack of trust throughout kind of like all of the coaches. It's not as ubiquitous as normal like hospitality industry or kind of something like that where you can kind of switch from one to the other. And so, yeah, I mean, to the training secrets, I'm glad that they're out there. A, they're not a secret, but B, if it helps anybody, whether it's an athlete or a coach that's out there, great. I think if it's good for one, it's going to be good for the gander. And if anything, if it helps raise the awareness around coaching in ultra marathon, great. We're all going to be a whole lot better off. And that wasn't always the case. I mean, there's a section in the kind of the prelogue or chapter 1 of the book, and this is an honest to God, truthful story. I'm not exaggerating it by any means. Where in the early 2000s, I went around to all the elite ultra runners, and I got laughed at all those meetings, every single one of them. Coaching is not for elite, ultra marathoners. It doesn't really belong in the sport. I'm just going to run a bunch of miles, and most of those people are out of the sport right now. Let's put it that way. But to see that tide change, it doesn't happen. A, it doesn't happen overnight, but B, it also doesn't happen if you have, or it only happens if you have good and efficacious training practices kind of around it. And now, you look at the landscape and it's a common practice. Yeah, not every elite athlete has a coach, but it's a common practice and it's accepted, and people don't like look at me sideways when I mention it to them and things like that. So it's been neat to see that kind of evolve as well. And once again, that's all a byproduct of not having any secrets or anything like that, and wanting to kind of share all this information out there in whatever way I can.
Yeah, and I've always chuckled when people are like, "Aren't you giving away all your secrets?" I'm like, "It's
Yeah, there are no
science. They're not
secrets.
secrets." Like, this is published information, which I think is also very interesting about the book. And this was maybe the most stressful part of the entire process for me. But the book had two different, very, very, very smart individuals do kind of like a scientific edit of the entire book. And you know
Sure.
exactly why I was so nervous about this, because I had to go through every single comment on every single word I wrote. And sometimes I said, yes, this is a good change to make. And sometimes I pushed back on it because I was like, no, 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 this is what I intended to write. But can you tell the listeners a little bit about that process? Because I think it's unique. I think that it brings some credibility, more credibility even to the material that
Yeah,
we're trying to
well,
put out
let
there.
me kind of like back up a little bit, because this doesn't happen without the story that sets it up, and I'm not going to get too far into it, but I do think it's kind of material. So in the first edition of the book, I wanted the exact same thing. I wanted some level of scientific scrutiny applied to it. And there's a realistic budget constraint around this. I mean, this is not David Goggins. We're not selling, millions of copies of this thing. And so that scientific content I really had to cajole out of two people that I'm very fortunate that would lend some of their expertise, and that's Roger Crom, one of my old biomechanics professors that's at the University of Colorado Boulder, and one of the most foremost biomechanists in the entire world, and former Western States Medical Director Marty Hoffman. And they very, very graciously donated their time to very limited sections of the book, very, very limited sections of the book. And so when COVID hit, I had the opportunity to essentially acquire the rights to self-publish it, and I did so. And we can talk about that at the end of this if that's a relevant topic or not. But the salient point for this conversation, it kind of gave me more flexibility to do what I wanted to do. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was I wanted to bring more scientific scrutiny to the book. A, because I know more eyes would be on it, and with more eyes comes more scrutiny. But B, I wanted to be intellectually honest with myself in terms of the way that I was presenting the scientific literature, because what we do as coaches is we always look at the scientific literature, and when we're forming best practices from it. And there's two steps in that process. There's coming up with the right interpretation of what the literature is actually telling you, and that is not just as simple as reading the conclusions, right, which is what a lot of people want to do. It's making sure you understand the methods and the entirety of the paper and what it's actually telling you, and then it's taking those results and taking those conclusions and then actually making sense out of them and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do with an athlete. So that two-step process, it happens, 100,000 times within the book, right? It's constantly citing scientific literature and best practice and trying to alchemize those two variables. And so I wanted to bring a greater degree of scientific scrutiny to the table to make sure that at A, I was representing the science correctly, and B, I was translating that science into actual practice correctly. And so I wanted people that not only understood the science very well, but also were athletes themselves and or coaches themselves that could make that second translation. So it wasn't a strict like academic review, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And so I brought in Stephanie Howe and Nick Taylor, both PhDs, both fantastic, both well-respected ultra runners in their own right. Stephanie's obviously won Western States, and Nick's done Marathon des Sables, is a contributor to Scientific Inquirer. He's very skeptical, or no, wait, Scientific Skeptical. And God dang it, I'm going to screw the name of this magazine up. Corinne, link it in the show notes. But anyway, his like marquee his marquee publication is the Sports Skeptics Guide, or the Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science. I got the title right there. It, it's a
It's
very, yeah,
brilliant.
it's a
It's
very
really
very good
good. We'll
book. So
link it.
anyway, I had both of them separately pour through the entirety of the manuscript, and yeah, I mean that's a nerve wracking, very humbling process. At the end of the day, you've got to own the content, right, Corinne? You just mentioned you've got to go through the edits, and it's your voice. You got to own what's ultimately in there. You're going to either take the advice or not take the advice. But to bring that level of scientific and practical scrutiny to the book, I can't express how much that raised the level of the content itself, but also my confidence in the content. And I know my confidence in the content is kind of like neither here nor there for the listeners, but you really never know if what you're putting out there is worth a darn unless you bring smarter people into the room to scrutinize it. And so we certainly did that with Steph and Nick. And yeah, I mean, I think it's cool. I mean, I don't know a lot of, there are not a lot of books out there like this at all, but there's not a lot of even material. I mean, you publish for, I run far. You're not putting that through scientific scrutiny on every single on every single article. They're still very good, but it doesn't have a level of scientific scrutiny that we could kind of bring to the book. So yeah, it's cool, and I can say that from where the book started before they got it to where they ended up, there were a lot of material differences where I looked at something differently and said, okay, I'm going to change the way that I explain this, or I'm going to bring in this other reference over here, or you know what, I didn't think about this angle, let me reword this one section. It made a tremendous positive impact on the final product. And I think it comes through even if you wouldn't have had known that it went through those two people to review. I think people will pick that up, just because of the level of accuracy of a lot of the of a lot of the content. I've heard from several people that it's very apparent that it went through that type of scrutiny.
Yeah, I mean, it was like it felt like extreme fact checking in a lot of ways, and it was really good. It was really good to be like, am I reading this right? Am I putting out what is something that makes sense to a wide audience but is still accurate? Because sometimes when you're trying to explain things in a way to a broad, very intelligent but still lay audience, when things are super sciency and jargon heavy, sometimes it can get lost in translation. So trying to bridge the gap there and make sure what you're saying is still accurate, and then have people who also, can see both sides of that. I thought that was very, like, for me and for my own writing, that was very beneficial to make sure that it was
Yeah.
scientifically factual while
Yeah.
still being understandable. And so
Those are
that
rare
was a big deal.
combos to have. I would say in the entirety of the space. I mean, Corinne, you interview people for podcasts, and I interview people for podcasts as well. There is a huge spectrum of people in the scientific community in terms of their ability to communicate their research, which they're domain experts on, to the lay public. They all know their stuff, but that communication piece, that second piece that I was talking about earlier, that part is a little bit more rare, and they make for the better podcast interviews in the first part. All their research is valuable, but it's very, very difficult to find those people that can understand the scientific side of it to the 99th percent of of the best people that do it in the world, and then also be able to to understand how to communicate that to a broader audience. Those are rare skill sets, and Steph and Nick just happen to have those. And like I said, I'm very fortunate to bring them on board.
Yeah, and then in part because of acquiring the rights to self-publish and speaking of Steph and Nick, they were also involved in what I think might be one of the coolest parts, besides it being in hardcover as well as in paperback, is the audiobook that has also been released. And not only is that great for, we actually had one of my former athletes reach out who's a visually impaired runner saying like, thank you so much. Like, it's so rare that we get technical writing in an audio format. I can't read books anymore. This is a gift. Like, this is so cool to have. And so, which I like,
Yeah.
that hadn't occurred to me when we were recording the audiobook at all. And to be able to reach that audience, I think is very, very special. Um, but in it, like, again, in like acquiring the rights, you got to do some fun stuff, including recording an audiobook. And it's not just Jason droning on, reading it from start, cover to cover. You did something really cool, and we kind of said, "Oh, it's David Goggins-esque." Was kind of like how we brainstormed it. Tell people who haven't maybe listened to it yet, or who are skeptical of listening to a book of this format in as an audiobook, like what does the final product look like, and how cool
Okay.
is it?
First off, it wasn't that fun to record. It was a neat project, but it was definitely one that caused me a lot of gray hairs, and I'll tell everybody why in a second. But before I get into that, anybody out there who is a visually impaired runner, or anybody that knows a visually impaired runner, the audiobook is on me. So contact me, contact Corinne. I'm very readily available through all social media channels. I'll give you a code to get the audiobook in whatever format uh, you're going to consume it in. I would just love for you to have it, because I do realize, just as you mentioned, Corinne, how scarce those resources are, and I want to get it out to as many athletes as I can. So let me just state that from the onset. um the audiobook was something that not pretty much everybody tried to dissuade me from doing it. And once again, I started this book under kind of the Vela Press Pocket Outdoor Media umbrella, and I finished this book underneath my own umbrella. And I have tons of friends in the publishing industry and things like that. Every single one of them not only told me not to do it, they told me it was a terrible idea. And, for whatever reason, I just had this wild hair up my ass that I wanted to do it. And the thing that kicked me over the edge was my late friend David Clark, who I asked him, because he's recorded several of his own audiobooks, which are more personal memoirs, not training books. And he said, dude, just do it. And you might lose a little bit of money on it at the end of the day, but at least you'll know you've actually done it. And I so the audiobook in the book is dedicated to him. And I recorded it in the same studio that he recorded his final audiobook in, like literally 2 weeks before he passed away. It was kind of a surreal experience. But I knew that I couldn't just read the text, because it's too boring and I'm not a good reader. Like those two things, like it's just fact, right? I don't, yeah,
Also,
reading is
reading is
reading is very
hard.
hard,
Reading is very
especially when
hard, it
you're a
turns out.
studio. But so in order to enhance the audiobook, I had two requirements. The first of which was relatively easy, is I just wanted to create a digital packet. And I wanted to make all the figures and all the tables freely available to the people that purchase the audiobook, because it is a very visual book. And somebody listening to it, if I refer to table 2.1, and it's the only way that I can really describe, what's going on, is visually, I want them to be able to like download a copy and kind of actually be able to look at it. And so that part is easy. Audible, in like within the Audible app, actually has a really cool way of accessing the PDF, where you don't even have to do anything. You just can kind of get right out of that screen and look at whatever is right there. But the second one was a little bit more of a flyer, and it was absolutely influenced by David Goggins's book "Can't Hurt Me," where he was the first one that I really think that even did this. Period, where he brought in these interviews with him and the person who is narrating the book to bring some of the more colorful stories to life. And I wanted to use that style to bring some of the reading to life. And so I brought in some of the very influential sports scientists and coaches and practitioners, to which I was referencing their work anyway. right? I was talking like Steven Seiler, right? I mean, I reference his work. I can't, there's probably 30 of his papers in the book. And so it made all the sense in the world to bring somebody like him in to talk about that and to bring some of that work that I was referencing to light. It has the additional effect of just breaking up the read because it's boring. I mean, it's just, it's not the most it's not storytelling, right? And you need breaks every once in a while in the read to kind of just spice things up. And so practically, if nobody's listened to it, what happens is about once a chapter, usually towards the end of the chapter or something like that, we're bringing in a domain expert for about a 15-minute interview to talk about what just transpired during the book and how to bring it to life in your own training, and how to bring that content to a little bit more of a practical level. And the people range the gamut from all your stereotypical sports scientists to obviously you, Corinne. We've got some of our coaches in there as well. I've got a couple of my athletes in there that kind of bring some of their training and then what we've done to light as well. And I, I I I did the quality control of the book while I was driving back from the Pacific Crest Trail, and it wasn't until I heard it in its entirety, all 17 hours worth or however long it is, to where I like kind of figured out how it pulled together very, very nicely. And a little bit of that is just luck that kind of worked out like that. But a lot of that is the audio engineer that I was working with up in Boulder. So shout out to Tuvia Levy, who was very gracious with his time in his studio and helping me kind of figure out how to piece all of these different parts together. And also to Jim Rutberg, who is a co-author who I made sit virtually in the studio with me for all, I think we racked up like 80 hours of recording time or something like that, for all 80 hours. And we were literally a lot of the we changed a lot of the way the read actually came out in real time, because a lot of times when you're reading it, you're like, oh, this just sounds stupid. When I say it out loud, it's correct, right? It's correct as written. And so we would go through that, and he very painstakingly listened through all that just to make sure that everything that we were trying to communicate actually did get communicated. So I'm super stoked about the audiobook. I've had a number of people already reach out to me that have both the audiobook and the physical book, and they're kind of using it as a companion to like reference each other. Yeah, so
Cool.
I'm stoked about it, and it's doing very, very well. It's one of those things I thought it'd sell like 100 copies, and it's gonna sell way more than that. So I'm psyched about it, and I think it turned out really well.
Yeah, it was books like this were listed alongside cookbooks and picture books as things you should not record as an audiobook. So I'm hoping that we kick that trend. But I also think that that's um a great shout out point too, is that the digital packet that you can access with the audiobook and all the graphs that are throughout the book, all the visuals throughout the book are done by one of your athletes, one of my teammates and really good friends, Abby Hall, and she brought some really terrible scribbles to life, which is amazing. Like I think it having now flipped through the new book once, getting to see that all lay out and to see the book in color and to see the
Yeah.
graphs in color, um, you know, I think that was another really cool part of self-publishing, was that to have the flexibility to do that and to have Abby involved in that process, I think was very, very cool. You've got people can't see this. It's obviously people are listening to this, but you've got her one of her jerseys on the wall behind you. So very cool to have
Yeah,
her
she
involved
was
in the project
great,
as well.
and she took every manner of early phase illustration that you and I had, Corinne, whether they were scribbles on a notebook or I had sent her stuff from my whiteboard to I'd screenshot things from, the scientific literature. You can imagine. I told her from the onset, I'm like, listen, I'm not an illustrator. I'm gonna huck stuff over the fence to you. Running, you were a great illustrator. You figure out how to make it look pretty. Like you just do your thing. And she did the whole thing from the color palette, which is I'm really stoked about, to the interior layout. She did all of that. And she even did this really cool thing where there's a lot of these like Easter eggs in the book, kind of starting with the cover. So if somebody can figure out, what the Easter egg is on the cover, I'll figure out a prize. Yeah,
Those
I'll
calves give it away.
I'll give you a prize. But the the chapters are kind of demarked by topo maps. that have a certain color treatment to it, and they're all topo mats of iconic courses, but you have to kind of look at them to find a feature that you might know having run that course. So it's just like little, yeah, it's just cool
So
stuff
cool.
like that that I think is, at the end of the day, it's a training book, and that's what people are gonna kind of come to it for. But when you bring all of these other elements in it, you know that everybody involved, from myself to you, Ruddy, the illustrator, and even the editors and the you know poor cat who I had to do the index, they're all vested in the project, right? And it comes out in the way that the content is all tied together.
Yeah, I think we all had a mega sigh of relief when we found out it was finally approved and getting released on Amazon.
Yeah, not an easy process.
Right? It was not an easy process, but it's happened. It's out there. Many of you have it in hand already. And I think to kind of close out the show, I know that I have found this was a question I got asked recently that this year I produced a lot of content. I talked about running a lot. I wrote about running a lot. I, it was all consuming and inundating in a lot of ways. And so I'm wondering through that process of producing a lot of content yourself, what is something that you've recently consumed, either reading, watching, or listening, outside of your own book or your own writing or your own podcast that has brought you joy and that the listeners might enjoy?
Right out of the gate, I finished most of it just recently. Is Kate Bennett's book, Treating Athletes with Eating Disorders. This is something that I've wanted this for 20 years. I mean, ever since I became a coach, I've had an athlete that has been suffering with an eating disorder, and it's something that I stumble around. I can't even articulate, how difficult that's kind of been for me to navigate as a coach. And to have a manual written by somebody who not only has clinical experience but also practical experience as an athlete, that can tie together the clinical and the practical and the practitioner worlds is just something that I really that I just so desperately wanted for so long, and I finally got it. That's the first one. And then the second one, I'm looking back at my bookshelf right now. Where is it? It's concurrent strength training and endurance training. It's by the group out of Norway. God, I can't see it right now. Anyway, those, yeah, link in
We'll
the
link
show
it. We'll
notes.
link it in the show
That was
notes.
a really good one. That it's it's not quite as recent from a publication standpoint, but from me actually digging into it, it's certainly more. It's certainly more. Oh, and then the other one was, hold on one second. I'm gonna go get it. It's this one. Speaking of dog-eared pages and whatnot, it's endurance, performance, and sport: the psychological theory and interventions. Once again, it's a sports psychology book that I wish I would have had 20 years ago. And the podcast listeners can't see this, but there's probably 100 different pink and green sticky notes throughout this throughout this entire thing. This is one that I actually dug into to get the mental skills chapter really honed down. And since I got that down, I took another breeze through it recently, and it's very, very good. And I'm a much better coach having consumed that content afterwards. It's a good book.
Amazing. Well, we will leave our listeners there. Thank you so much for making time to join me today. But everyone else should stick around because we're going to give you a little listen into some clips from the audiobook to hopefully encourage you to maybe go download that as well. It's always a pleasure to sit down and have a conversation with Jason, and I think I too will continue to follow the theme of zooming out in 2022, both personally and with my athletes. As promised, the next clip you're about to hear is from the audiobook version of Training Essentials for Ultrarunning, the second edition. This specific clip is from Chapter 5 and gives you a little taste of how we used interviews to explore specific topics throughout the book, breaking up those chapters. The clip includes a segment with Wouter Hoogkamer, whose name might sound familiar and it's hard to pronounce, but he's a brilliant biomechanist who has worked on most of the carbon plated shoe research, including the Breaking 2 project. We hope you enjoy.
I know this is a big, complicated topic, but can we generally summarize what is fundamentally different between running on flat level terrain, uphill running, downhill running, and hiking?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think mechanically, the easiest way to think about it is that running is just bouncing around on the level. So on level running, we're just bouncing. But then when we go uphill, you need to gain that elevation, right? So you need to push off forward way more. So that's a big difference where we need to put energy into our running movement by driving ourselves forward, which is along the slope up the hill. And then for the downhill part, it's kind of the opposite. We have the gravitation on our side, but if we just go with it, we're starting to run faster than we can keep up with. So for the downhill running, it is more absorbing the energy. So every time you place your foot, you need to slow yourself down a bit. But at the same time, we're running here a race often, so we don't want to slow ourselves down too much. And then the big difference between walking and running is basically the time that you spend on the ground. So when we're hiking up a hill, we're no longer bouncing. We no longer have a short period of time where we can produce a lot of force, but we can take our time and we can go through a larger range of motion at a slower rate. And that, at the level of the muscles, is also totally different than what we see in running. So those are the big differences between those four modes.